what I wanted to say just in 1 second is thank you very much, Dave, for being with us and for being available, discussing your wonderful and interesting paper and article. And I welcome the discussion very much. And I give the floor to the first participants to comment and to ask questions. But before, maybe, David, you can introduce shortly what you had behind the rationale of the paper, the path-breaking rethinking you are proposing of the concept of neighborhood, etc., etc. So thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I want to thank everyone who is listening as well. Hopefully, you will soon change from listeners to speakers. So I'll just say a bit about what I was trying to do with this piece. I mean, I came to this topic in reaction to the neighborhood effects literature. I was researching sort of urban development and urban politics in New York, and I got my PhD in a sociology department, and I think actually it's quite relevant to this topic that neighborhood effects, I think, really does sort of form the mainstream of urban sociology as opposed to urban geography and interdisciplinary urban studies, and at least in the US. But various people kept on sort of suggesting that I engage with neighborhood effects literature, and this is sort of what I came up with. I found the concept of neighborhood there to be quite empirically questionable. If any of you have read a lot in that literature, and actually I'd love to hear from you if you have been contributing to it as well. But if you read in it, you really do see these sort of tightly bounded sort of zones. As I said, they're sort of quasi-Westphalian sort of zones that are held to be independent variables that explain variation in the neighborhood effects literature. And so I just found it very sort of empirically and sort of conceptually problematic, but also deeply problematic politically, because the neighborhood effects literature in the US and in the UK as well is really an example of urban social science that is sort of part of this project of dismantling a lot of the sort of spaces of the Keynesian welfare state, and so the neighborhood effects literature is part of sort of what's promoting this argument about concentrated poverty and hence the need to dismantle public housing. So there's this sort of question about the politics of urban knowledge, which I find quite interesting as well. And so as I sort of thought more about this idea, I realized that neighborhood is a really central sort of key word for urbanism today. Neighborhoods are some of the major ways and the sort of benefits of neighborhoods and neighborhood life and the political and social imperative to sort of foster neighborhood life are some of the central ways in which urban development today is legitimized, debated, and practiced. And the idea is rarely scrutinized, and if anything, generally lauded. And this is something that you see sort of liberal urbanists affirming, something that you see neoconservative and just sort of paleoconservative urbanists affirming. So I wanted to sort of develop a critical perspective on it. I also had this sort of vague sense that the moral affirmation of the idea of neighborhood could be traced to the very sort of formation of urban social science. But I was sort of quite surprised and fascinated with some of these sort of older discourses of neighborhood. I mean, if you read some of the sort of early 20th century literature on the idea of neighborhoods in the city, you see language that is sort of clearly problematic and objectionable, and that's so clearly sort of symptomatic of a particular epistemological approach to the city. But very similar ideas are central to urban social science today. They're just really not read as such, so I was trying to sort of recover that. And I also just see the sort of motif of neighborhood in a lot of other urban debates today, about debates about placemaking, and the whole sort of idea of placemaking is very closely connected to the sort of politics of neighborhood. Debates about housing and public housing, about gentrification, and sort of debates about the politics of urban development generally. So there's always just this sort of talk about what's good for the neighborhood, about the sort of imperative to do what's good for the neighborhood. And I think it's rhetoric like this that urbanists need to be scrutinizing, historicizing, and politicizing. So the sort of major interest of mine here is this sort of idea of neighborhood and the politics of neighborhood. But secondly, I have also sort of long been interested in this sort of word project, which is this sort of underdeveloped social theory resource. I mean, you sort of find it in many different sources of social theory and social philosophy. You see it being used by Habermas. He talks about the unfinished project of modernity. You see it being used by someone like Bernard Williams. And you see it being used by all of these different voices in urban theory, and especially critical urban theory. And so Lefebvre talks about projects and sort of projections and Castells. I mean, you see where I discuss it in the paper. And I think that this idea can sort of help us capture the ways in which instrumentalization happens. So projects have goals, they have directions, but these goals and these directions and these values, I guess, are the outcomes of struggle and the objects of struggle. So with this sort of notion of spatial project, I want to sort of understand how urban space is shaped by these sort of struggles and how places, how spaces, ideas, political movements, different groups sort of mobilize and become mobilized in the process of pursuing project as a struggle. And as I say, obviously, profit making has been the overriding project in capital cities, and I mean, neighborhood has been sort of pursued and produced and sought after as an economic project to an extent that I think neighborhood champions don't necessarily quite appreciate. But as I say, I think we need to understand how state actors and so many groups also participate in sort of neighborhood projects, and how they offer alternative neighborhood projects, how they struggle within neighborhood projects, and in general the sort of dynamics of these essentially political phenomena. So that's basically where I was coming from when working on this. I am more than happy to discuss any other topics that the group is interested in. And I guess I'd also like to hear from some of you, just your sort of reactions to this piece. If you think if I've succeeded at providing a critical theory of the neighborhood, and if the sort of image of neighborhood and its contestations sort of matches your own experiences studying and living in neighborhoods in other cities around the world. I mean, I'm quite conscious of the fact that this is a very New York-centric story, and even just now living in London, I see that sort of neighborhood and sub-metropolitan urban territoriality in general works quite differently here than in New York. But so I'd like to sort of hear just a bit about the traction or lack thereof that you feel that this offers on neighborhoods throughout the world. And as well, I'm wondering if any of you are sort of, I don't know, are a bit more positive about the sort of affirmation of neighborhood than I am. I mean, you can sort of see I'm quite skeptical about a lot of neighborhood-centric political projects and political languages, but I'm wondering if any of you actually would like to sort of defend the idea of neighborhood per se as an urban public good, and if we could talk about that. And then finally, it would just be great to talk about this idea of spatial projects and just to sort of flesh this out a bit, and if you are convinced by my development of the idea here. So thanks again to all of you in advance for participating, and to Giovanni and Yuri for inviting me. So let's open it up to some other people now, if that's okay.
That's great. Thank you, David. The first person who is speaking, I mean, who would like to intervene in the discussion, it's Lindsay Owen. She's in a cyber cafe in Johannesburg, so she can't actually speak. But she's using the chat on the right side to post her question. David, would you be so nice to read aloud her question so that it gets recorded in our audio discussion, and after maybe answer to it?
Sure, great. So she says, "Hi, David. My name is Lindsay Howe. I'm a doctoral student at the ETH Zurich in Switzerland, advised by Christian Schmid, investigating urban restructuring processes in Johannesburg, where the concept of neighborhood is also very significant in forming identities and policies, and is equally questionable, particularly in regard to informal settlements. It seems like in Brooklyn, your more fluid conception of neighborhood delineation is bounded both by competing or overlapping interests, and also includes physical elements like the Farragut housing developments. I was wondering how you could comment on the psychological process of the neighborhood as a spatial project. For example, in Dumbo, how much are people a product of the contested branding of their environment, and how much is their environment a product of these dominant attitudes and interventions? And can there be urban renewal projects without displacement?" Wow, okay, so there's a lot in this question, so thank you for sending this. The first thing that I would say, right, exactly, there are a lot of questions. Thank you, yeah. The first thing I'd say is that, I don't know, the sort of physical elements have sort of an ambivalent role, at least in this neighborhood project. I mean, there's no sort of canonical sort of statement of neighborhood and its limits. I mean, I think this is true in New York and in most places. I mean, there are obviously some cities where there are sort of administrative geographies that have clearly identifiable limits. But even there, I think you'll see that the sort of idea of neighborhood has this sort of political, social, cultural, mental surplus that sort of overflows these boundaries. But so here in Brooklyn, I mean, it's always sort of a debate. Is Dumbo a neighborhood project that has space for it to include? There's space within it to include public housing. And this is something that public housing residents themselves are debating. It's something that the sort of activists and, I don't know, the sort of professional stakeholders in the neighborhood are debating. And I mean, it's something that has a million different sort of representations. I mean, I think it's that there is a sort of hegemonic version of this idea of Dumbo as a sort of neighborhood of distinction and as a quite affluent space. I mean, this is by many measures one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city. But there's, you know, it sort of includes the territory of Farragut and maybe of other NYCHA developments, but it sort of erases their interests. It erases their presence. And so this is exactly the sort of problem with Dumbo as an idea that that a lot of Farragut residents, they by the way, they reject the term tenants, which is a sort of New York public housing wide thing. But a lot of Farragut residents, they sort of actively disidentify with Dumbo, and I think when they do that, they're saying, look, this is a project that does not include us. There was a lot of sort of disconnected thoughts. I don't know if that sort of answers your question, but hello? Great, thank you.
Yes, David. Okay, Lindsay gave you a great thanks, so that's fine. Now I was trying to get in touch with the second person, which should be Laura Wentz. Okay, she's working on shortening her question. Okay, so it's proposing Oliver. Roy, can you write, or do you want to speak, Oliver? Right. Okay. You just write. Okay, David. There is your question. The procedure is always the same.
Great. Okay. So,
okay.
Olivier's question is: if the production of neighborhood is admittedly, quote, inherently political and often conflictual, close, how can conflict, political or otherwise, help achieve the spatial project? Can it be used as a positive, constructive force or process to spatialize ongoing struggles, all the while reducing socioeconomic inequity and spatial segregation in light of contemporary neoliberal power issues and dynamics characterizing urban settlements? I take this as asking a question that if sort of neighborhood spatial projects are inherently political, is it inherently an elitist project? Is it inherently a neoliberal project, or could there be democratic sort of spatial projects that animate neighborhood? Am I right about that? Is that what you're asking? Pretty much. Okay. Conflict mostly, yes. Okay. Well, so I mean, first, I think that spatial projects, at least the way I'm sort of imagining this term, it wouldn't necessarily be something that is sort of achieved so much as sort of ongoing process, and I think that that's part of the sort of rhythm of neighborhood development. Again, at least in sort of capital cities, this sort of idea that it is sort of inherently open-ended and always in some sort of moving forward. But I sort of see this as a process that can go in many different directions, obviously. So there are, in the history of New York and in the history of, I would wager most cities, moments when there are more democratic projects for neighborhood production, and moments when there are less so. In the early 20th century, New York had a number of incredibly sort of creative and, in many cases, quite radical neighborhood, sort of working class neighborhood projects. I actually think that the sort of period of the period that people tend to sort of refer to shorthand as the modernist urban renewal was a much more sort of ambivalent set of neighborhood projects than people recognized. There were sort of radical spatial projects in the 60s and 70s. I think that in the neoliberal era, there's fewer sort of radical and emancipatory and sort of working class spatial projects. It's definitely not impossible, but it is something that we're sort of tending not to see now. On this idea of conflict, again, I think it sort of depends on how things go. I mean, I think there are examples of sort of struggles over the meaning, direction, identity of neighborhood, struggles over neighborhood space that sort of just engaging in these conflicts politicizes urbanites in different ways. I mean, I think you can actually see this in London with a lot of contemporary housing activism, in that you have sort of developers sort of pursuing a particular idea of neighborhood, and there's this sort of counter reaction that is sort of born precisely from these conflicts that I think is in some cases offering an entirely different sort of neighborhood politics in general. But I see that there's some writing it and some of it is in red text, so I'll stop now. I see there's another question as well.
Okay, David, thank you very much. Now we have another question by Lydia, but she should be able to speak. So I'm opening her microphone now. Lydia, can you speak?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, clearly.
Okay, thank you, David, for your article, especially for placing the case of Dumbo in Brooklyn also in an historical perspective, which is something that I really appreciated. Also having the opportunity to compare with my case study for my doctoral project that was based on Brooklyn Park Slope, which is another very, let's say, famous gentrified neighborhood in the same area, more or less. And I would like here to question the connection between gentrification and displacement, especially when only small amounts of direct displacement have occurred. So we can talk here, you were already mentioned in your article about Peter Marcuse, so his conceptualization about displacement pressure. But here your case seems indeed more interesting because who live in Farragut, they are working class people who have rights to stay in their public housing, so to stay put, let me say. And my question is that within this frame, it's difficult to know to what extent displacement itself can be assumed as a major category of analysis instead of focusing on, I don't know, microtactics, practices of resistance. You mentioned this at the very end of your paper, to such a way to understand this unequal urban order.
Yeah, this is an excellent question. Thank you so much for this. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely sort of thinking of this idea sort of in dialogue with Peter's concept of displacement pressure. But I think I don't know. I guess on the one hand, I sort of agree with you that I don't know, the idea of displacement shouldn't be seen as the sort of master category by which we debate the harms of elitist and exclusionary urban development. There are other sort of terms to use. There are other sort of elements of this process that displacement doesn't have to sort of carry all of this critical weight on its own. On the other hand, I think that it is important, and not just a sort of theoretical sort of import into the situation. Housing activists have long tended to sort of use displacement as a master category, and it's something that people organize around. It is something that people respond to. I mean, if neighborhood maybe is a sort of mystifying concept in contemporary urban debate, I think displacement is maybe a sort of, I don't know, critical popular concept. I mean, it's a term by which people do sort of start to understand a bit of the sort of power dynamics about contemporary urban development. So I think it's sort of important that way. And at the same time, I think that sort of in this case of sort of displacement without moving, and in many others, people really do experience this as a form of displacement, as a form of as a sort of loss of place. And I think it's a lot of the sort of politics of neighborhood sort of gets worked out in this direction as well, about sort of claiming space and being erased from space. So I think it is, in some cases, sort of displacement in a very direct sense. So, obviously there is the sort of connection to, I don't know, sort of displacement in the gentrification, in the sort of everyday gentrification narrative. But I actually think there's quite a lot there sort of surrounding the ideas of displacement and of placement.
Very good, thank you very much. Now we're gonna have the question by Laura, which is, she can post it. And we can have also the question by Laura. She's gonna, wow, she shortened it.
It's also, by the way, if people want to sort of respond to my responses, I think that's really great. So if you, after I answer your question, you want to say something, please speak up somehow. Or
okay, I think that if someone has something to say, they can just write in the chat so that we can have some kind of dialogue.
Great. It actually looks like Lydia has a response, maybe. No, or?
Okay. Lydia, would you like to say something? Or you're all right?
Hello, Lydia. Okay, well, that's fine. We can come back.
Okay, I think that Laura, after we can go back if we want to Lydia.
Great.
Okay, please, David, the floor is yours again.
Well, yeah. Why don't you read your question, Laura? That would be great.
Okay, Laura can. Okay, let's see. I'm opening your microphone, Laura.
Thank you.
Are you
Hi,
there?
everybody. Hi, David.
Hi, Laura.
So my question is, in the case of Dumbo, I found it super intriguing that the name was initially created as a form of disavowal towards the whole corporatization of the area. And to me, it has provided an interesting spin to the narrative, because I always thought Dumbo itself as a naming was already sort of a branding exercise. So my question relates more to the practice of place naming and the role of toponymy and naming within spatial projects. So I'm thinking about this also from the context of South African post-apartheid cities, where place naming has or is still regularly soliciting heated, controversial public debates. So my question is probably historical when it comes to your research and the development of Dumbo. Were you able in your ethnography to determine at what point in the process of this neighborhood remaking it was that the meaning of Dumbo changed from this sort of artist-induced, almost Dadaist anti-name to this commercial, clearly exclusive brand? And also, more of a broader question, what does this naming say about the displacement of a sense of belonging? So more of a cultural displacement, because we're talking about the displacement that isn't necessarily physical. So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, no, this is great. Thank you. And I wanted a paper on sort of critical toponymy of neighborhoods, and there is a sort of small and I think quite interesting sort of critical toponymy literature in geography that, if you're interested in this, you can look up, or if you want to email me, I can send you some citations on it. But I think it's quite an interesting phenomenon, and it has a lot to do with the sort of cultural and social sort of roots of this neighborhood project. I mean, I think it's quite clear when the term sort of became an official brand, and that's when Two Trees Development Company started using it. I mean, at first they're quite embarrassed of this idea, which is exactly what the sort of Dumbo, the people who eventually became the Dumbo Neighborhood Association wanted to happen. But eventually they realized that there is cultural cachet in having an artist-induced Dadaist anti-name. And this is, I mean, I think it sort of gets to a sort of question that I think a lot of us have when we look at situations like Dumbo's development over the years. I mean, was there any sort of enduring critical potential in sort of Dumbo as an anti-development project? It's really hard to say. The people who were sort of participating in Dumbo sort of under the sort of identity of artists or as sort of neighborhood champions, many of them, they have a very sort of distinctive place in real estate markets. They tend to be quite affluent and quite educated, and I mean it was a sort of upper middle class artistic project, and or sort of project that wanted to see itself as the sort of champion of artists in the neighborhood, and not a sort of working class project. And I think that's sort of important to see. So it was quite a clever strategy that people tried to adopt, but I wonder if it was perhaps bound to fail from the beginning. And I'm sort of on the larger issue of toponymy. I mean, I think it is an important issue, the sort of names under which people organize. I mean, not necessarily on its own sake, but I think that the sort of neighborhood names end up naming particular social and economic projects. If you look in, I didn't include any maps or diagrams, which sort of rereading this piece I probably should have. But if you look at some city publications, even from not that long ago, I mean 10 years ago, the whole area is called Farragut, and or called Fort Greene, which about 20 years ago I think really referenced much more of a sort of working class cosmopolitan, but definitely African American sort of neighborhood project. And I think the more that these are I don't know, sort of work their way into official documents and official urban strategies, I think this does have real material effects. So I think people really are struggling over resources, over sort of really significant urban things when they're sort of struggling over neighborhood names. And that's also neighborhood names, if you sort of look back in history over the different names that neighborhoods have had, and it's a sort of archive of lost neighborhood projects. And it does sort of open up this picture about different directions that have been sort of pursued by the producers of urban space in this area. So I think it's quite interesting. I mean, it's difficult to study because toponyms can change their sort of meaning without changing the word. So it's not just a matter of, oh, look, when this area was called Farragut, or when this area was called Fort Greene, then it was a particular kind of space, and then when people started calling it Dumbo, it changes. I mean, these names have different meaning. As I said, the name Fort Greene, which is, as I said, another area in Brooklyn, itself has changed quite a bit. So there's a lot of complexity here, and I think it's not a matter sort of methodologically just of tracing old names on old maps. But I do think it opens up to really significant urban political issues. I see that some people want to respond to this, so I'll shut up now.
Okay, I don't know if you read that question by Laura, follow-up question about if there was the idea of changing the name Dumbo in something else, David.
Oh, were they trying to change to something else? Yeah, well, there was a sort of counterplan that the Dumbo Neighborhood Association offered to what became the local plan to redevelop the area that was being promoted by real estate interests, and they used the term Old Brooklyn, which is another sort of neologism. And the thought there was that it was trying to sort of recapture a different historical narrative for the area. I mean, this is actually, if you're not familiar with Brooklyn or with New York, this was the site of the original Dutch colonial village called Brooklyn, and it is in some sense the sort of origin of the place named Brooklyn in this part of the world itself. And so I mean, you can see why people like this idea of calling it Old Brooklyn. I think it's clear that it's never a matter of, what is a neighborhood actually called, or what is a neighborhood actually for, or, what is the sort of true character of a neighborhood. These things are always up for debate. So people, the people who are sort of promoting the idea of Old Brooklyn have their own project, and it's very similar to the sort of Dumbo idea, maybe before it was fully championed by real estate. If you talk to housing organizers and activists and residents of Farragut houses, I mean, it's quite interesting. I was doing field work and sort of going door to door with this organizer, and we were talking about neighborhood names. And so talking about Vinegar Hill, which is a neighborhood sort of nearby, and Dumbo, and he kept on saying, why don't they call it what it actually is? Farragut. It's called Farragut. Stop trying to come up with these new names. And I think it's clear that he's talking about more than just names, obviously. I had another fieldwork informant in Farragut houses who kept on saying, Dumbo is a fucking elephant. And this idea of Dumbo as this sort of bulldozer, sort of elephant trampling the whole area, I think is quite interesting as well. But yeah.
Okay, before the floor to Azat, there is Lydia, which has a follow-up question. So I'm gonna open her microphone and she can have this. Please, Lydia.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, yeah,
Yes.
great.
Okay, so David, you were saying that displacement is also sort of rhetorical, has a sort of rhetorical power in itself, because community institution and people can advocating for the rights of the powerless, just using this word with its very, very powerful meaning. But there are also other urban spaces where the process of gentrification is characterized by, of course, contextual variables also, like, for instance, in Italy, where I come from, home ownership rate is around 75–80%. So people just don't move because, of course, they have rights to stay there. And so they complain, just let me say in a very simple way, about other things, about the changes, all the changes in the building of a distinctive kinds of neighborhood you were clearly stating in your paper. So if we are talking about displacement as a conceptual, as a theoretical, in a theoretical way, I don't know, it's maybe not something that we can apply all over.
Mm. Yeah, no, I totally agree with that, and I think it's quite interesting, these cases of which there are many, where sort of struggles over place and space in urban areas are not struggles over displacement or placement. But I don't know. I mean, I think there's also, I think there is a sort of dimension of sort of placedness that that people might be sort of referencing when they are I don't know, sort of feeling aggressed by neighborhood changes or the sort of projects to build sort of distinctive or hip neighborhoods or whatnot. I mean, I think there may be a sort of placement element here, but as you say, not a sort of mobility question. I mean, I guess my point is just that the sort of politics of displacement should not be seen as restricted to the politics of involuntary mobility.
Very good. Now I'm going to give the floor to Azat Gundogan. Azat, can you try to speak?
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. Please, you can post your question.
Thank you so much. Hello, David. Hello, everybody. So I'm a marine sociologist, and I have done my PhD research in the satellite city of Istanbul, named Gebze, which I can define as the New Jersey of Istanbul. So, I did my ethnographic and historical research in 2 working class neighborhoods in that city. And these neighborhoods were targeted as the sites of urban renewal projects. And you may guess the repercussions for the communities, right? Potential displacement and dispossession, etc. And they struggled in various forms. So the gist of your article is the critique of spatial fetishism of neighborhood, which I like very much. And as a researcher, ethnographer with a similar critical spatial approach, I'm aware of the fact that apparently the never-ending antagonism between the use value and exchange value forces us to seek for more qualitative thinking or research when it comes to understanding the gist of the social and the political, right? So I would like to hear more about the methodological implications of the reconceptualization of neighborhood as spatial project. So we read that you are critical of the overly quantitative orientation in the field. So what other qualitative techniques can be more efficient in neighborhood research?
Yeah, no, thanks for this. That's a great question as well. I mean, I think I wouldn't say that, I don't know, that somehow the sort of basic idea of quantitative studies of neighborhood or of the sort of relationship between inequality and place is always already objectionable. I was at least trying to say that I think that if there was a bit more sort of truly critical reflection on concepts within the neighborhood effects literature, I think it could be quite a valuable document of sort of unequal distribution of resources of all sorts of things. But I do think that there is, I don't know, there's a sort of inescapably qualitative aspect to the idea of studying neighborhoods. And I mean, I think the basic idea is just sort of always historicize, first of all, that these are projects that emerge historically and are worked out over time and that develop and change over time. And so I think sort of the more that neighborhood researchers do sort of historicize these projects, the more successful they'll be. I mean, I think in general, the basic sort of methodological, I don't know, takeaway that I sort of take from this from this paper is the idea that you really do need to have some sort of skepticism about whenever people invoke neighborhood or its interests, or whenever people talk about the boundaries of neighborhood. I mean, there were many times when I was doing this field work and I was talking, and very little of it ended up in this article, and I think another sort of reflection that I had reading it again was that I wish I had included more of the sort of voices of my fieldwork informants. But there were many times that I was talking to some champions of Dumbo and the idea of Dumbo, and who really saw their neighborhood under threat by developers. Though, as I was saying, that very sort of perspective I think is really part of the sort of Dumbo project, not a critical perspective on it. But I would ask them about Farragut houses, and they'd always say, "Oh, well, that's not our neighborhood. That's a different neighborhood." I mean, any time anyone sort of invokes neighborhood boundaries in that sense, they're sort of doing something politically. They're making particular kinds of claims, and I think it's just always important to pay attention to that. So I guess sort of critical scrutiny and the sort of imperative to historicize are I guess what I hope would be the sort of methodological lessons from this study. But I see you have a follow-up, or I see that Giovanni is asking if you have a follow-up.
Okay, that's good. I was asking if Azat would like to have a follow-up, like we've done before, but he doesn't answer, so obviously he doesn't. So now there is a question by Kansu Chidelek. I hope that is the correct pronunciation. And this time, David, I'm afraid that you will need to read it because Kansu cannot speak. So thank you.
So in the conclusion, you say that this is the question. In the conclusion, you say that it would be worthwhile to imagine alternative urban knowledge that might contribute to projects for more democratic, egalitarian neighborhoods, which is an optimistic conclusion and which is great in theory. Fair enough, by the way. But how can we achieve a more egalitarian neighborhood if we consider that there are always complex and contesting interests and players, and if there would always be some groups which would have more power in terms of financial or cultural capital than others? I ask this because in many cases, voices of the urban poor are not allowed to be expressed. Also, ethnography and critical research contribute to praxis and struggle for more democratic urbanization, which goes beyond the theoretical assumptions and conclusions. I know this is rather a very large question, but it would be great if you could say more about these. Thank you. This is an excellent question and indeed quite large. I think you're getting at a lot of important issues here. And I mean, I don't know, one of the sort of audiences for a sort of critical idea of neighborhood would be urbanists and planners and policymakers. So I mean, sort of one of the ways in which a sort of critical approach to neighborhoods could potentially lead to more egalitarian urban spaces, I think would be if there was, I don't know, if there was a more sort of public contestation about neighborhood boundaries. I mean, people definitely, planners, policymakers, politicians, sort of urban experts. I mean, they're generally this is a generalization, but quite uncritical of the idea of neighborhood and of neighborhood boundaries. So I mean, I think it's a matter of sort of pushing the politics of neighborhood in slightly more egalitarian ways. There's no doubt that, I don't know, there's not, at least sort of on the scene in any city with which I'm familiar, there's no sort of running universalistic neighborhood projects that we can look to. It's true that there are always going to be some groups that are sort of seen to be the privileged subjects of neighborhood development, some of whom who are excluded. I mean, I think we probably would all agree that there's room for more democratic projects. And I mean this in a very sort of direct sense, that the sort of urban establishment really needs to engage with working class neighborhood projects, with alternative neighborhood projects, with neighborhood projects that are more inclusive and egalitarian than the ones which are currently prevailing. And as I said, obviously it is a matter of a struggle, and there's sort of identifiable reasons why we see the sort of privileged spatial projects that we do. But I think that I don't know. I think that there's sort of room for change in public debates about this. As far as sort of what ethnography and critical research can sort of contribute to this, I don't know. I think that there's a lot there. I mean, just sort of helping make clear what's at stake in neighborhood struggles, in urban development battles. I mean, I think it's actually quite important that we have sort of good critical research about this. I mean, partly because the public understanding of it is, I think, generally quite simplistic. And again, this is a generalization, but I don't know. I do think that the sort of coverage of urban issues in, say, the New York Times or the sort of, I don't know, urbanist and metropolitan public sphere, I mean, they're really sort of reproducing a lot of these sort of elitist perspectives on the city, and so I think that ethnography and critical research should be and could be antidote to that.
Okay, thank you very much. Azat, in the meanwhile, came back. He said that he totally agrees with you and with the importance of historicizing things. Now we have a question by Sara Linama, and I'm opening her microphone right now. So, Sara, can you speak?
Hello,
Sarah?
can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Yes, we can. Hi.
Great, hi. Thank you so much, David, for opening this line of questioning. Now, as an urban art and culture scholar, and I'm a postdoc in Canada, and during my research, I encounter many references to artistic objects for reworking and reimagining cities. And you account for how the concept of the spatial project can theoretically underpin an alternative understanding of the concept of neighborhood. Now, for me, it's easy to think of many other dimensions to the term, and you addressed some of this in your introduction, but I'd kind of like to return to it a bit. So for one thing, I was thinking of Boltanski and Shapello, and they argue in The New Spirit of Capitalism how the term project and a concept projective city is used to account for the clever reconfiguration of labor under contemporary capitalism, especially for creative types and artists that were also identified as ideal types for the Dumbo development. Now, could you expand on your understanding of the term project and its theoretical resonance just a bit more, and this tension between it as a category for critical urban analysis, but also a way of repackaging neoliberal urban agendas under, for example, the rhetoric of creativity?
Yeah, no, that is a great question, and I actually sort of thought about engaging with Boltanski and Shapello's sort of usage, but I figured there was sort of enough in here already in the paper. But I mean, I think the idea is important to sort of capture the I don't know, the sort of shared goals and sort of works in progress that different groups have. So it's not purely a matter of sort of interests. I mean, there's a big sort of theoretical and methodological debate in sort of political sociology and urban sociology about this idea of sort of group interests, and I think project sort of shows this idea to be a bit more publicly contested and a bit more political. And so it really is the sort of process of formulating collective goals, collective directions, collective accounts of interests. I mean, it's a sort of project of publicly constituting an urban subject, maybe, and sort of drawing a boundary around particular groups, saying, you know, these are the people who matter. Their interests, their sort of personal projects and goals, they should be the ones that are privileged, that are considered important. And I mean, you really do see some projects become hegemonic when urban policy sort of adopts them as general general agendas or general goals. And at that point, the sort of specificity of a spatial project is sort of lost, and it's just established as, you know, the goals for a neighborhood or the goals for a city. I mean, I think one of the things that I was wanting to sort of say by specifying sort of sub-metropolitan scale was that spatial projects occur at many different scales, and I'm not totally sure I'd want to sort of say that cities end up functioning as spatial projects, but you can imagine sort of different scales in which to sort of identify spatial projects. But yeah, I mean, it's this sort of process of making certain goals and certain directions sort of hegemonic or official or just powerful, and this sort of idea of establishing a telos towards which groups will struggle and spaces will develop. I think it's quite interesting. I'd like to hear a bit more about these sort of art objects that you say that you are working with. I mean, I think spatial projects often supply an important context for artifacts, and especially for sort of art interventions. I mean, there's in Dumbo, there was a sort of public art project that was a sculpture by Tom Otterness, who is a sort of fairly well-known, actually quite well-known New York sculptor who had his studio in Dumbo, and says that, you know, the sort of relentless Two Trees projects kind of chased him out of the neighborhood. But he made this public sculpture that was, and he has a very sort of distinctive sculptural language, and there's a lot of Tom Otterness public art sort of throughout New York, and so it's quite an identifiable sort of cartoonish form. But it's sort of in typical style, this public art was an image of a pioneer wagon, and it was, I don't know, it was quite significant in Dumbo because part of the sort of, I don't know, artistic sort of Dumbo Neighborhood Association sort of perspective on the area is that they're pioneers, and this sort of idea of being a pioneer is obviously central to the sort of gentrification and sort of urban renaissance kind of ideology. And I think, I don't know, being sort of attuned to the sort of contestations of this sort of artistic project, and being attuned to just this whole sort of set of meanings that were circulating through the neighborhood at the time can really help understand something like that. So I wonder if there's not, I don't know, if there's not more to say about spatial projects as I don't know, as context and that can sort of help illuminate the meanings of artifacts, and especially of artistic artifacts.
Okay, David, would you like that we give again the floor to Sarah to follow up, or we have another question already?
If Sarah would like to follow up, that'd be great.
Okay, Sarah, I'm opening your microphone, please.
Yeah, actually, I'll just make a quick point. I guess what interests me is that a lot of kind of the artist versions of projects is they're very much trying to work in this idea of like kind of unbound spaces, right? Even though they're working through cities and specific places, but also trying to argue that as something that's very kind of contrary to the notion of a neighborhood. And I don't really have a question there, but it's just that something that kind of struck me is that there's certain inheritance for the term project that, even in its kind of Deleuze way, that is very much unfixed and very much trying to be that. So I don't know.
Yeah, no, sure, absolutely. I mean, unfixed, but something that I think does have some sense of sort of direction or sort of movement, and I think that's. I mean, it makes it. You can sort of understand why Habermas talks about the unfinished project of modernity. I mean, projects will always sort of, I don't know, be experienced and understood as unfinished to some extent, but they seem to be working towards some place or some thing, and I don't know. That's why I think it's a sort of useful concept to understand the types of struggles and activities that you see in urban neighborhoods. So.
Okay, David, did you finish that? Because in the meanwhile, I received a telephone call, so I couldn't follow your last.
No,
so
I see. There's another question.
Okay. Yes, there is another question by Guillermo, and he cannot speak, so you could read it, please.
Oh, he cannot speak. Okay, sure.
No, he can't. No, he can't.
Okay. So he says, "Hi, my name is Guillermo Yayamovich. I'm an assistant researcher at the University of Buenos Aires. Among other interesting issues, your paper connects academic debates with urban policies. Could you deepen into how to think or theorize those relations beyond the neighborhood case? I feel it is also an important contribution to the paper. How do we think those relations? Does urban studies give us the tools for that, or should we visit other traditions such as sociology of intellectuals or intellectual history? And what is the role of knowledge in urban policies and its effects, or how academic specific knowledge becomes useful for certain urban policies?" Yeah, thanks for this. This is exactly what I'm trying to sort of get at here with this idea of neighborhood, as I said. But I mean, I think it is right to say that there's a sort of larger question surrounding the urban sociology of knowledge. I mean, and again, a concept like neighborhood, or an idea like, I don't know, concentrated poverty, or I was sort of inspired to some extent by the concept of poverty knowledge, which comes from Alice O'Connor, who talks almost in a sort of Foucauldian way about the sort of intellectual history of the idea of knowledge about the poor. I mean, I think there's room for urban studies to engage more with the sort of history of the sort of science of urbanism, sort of how it came about, the connection it has to policy, the connection it has to the state, to other powerful actors, and I mean, in another paper, I sort of use this term, the urban sociology of knowledge, and I think it is something that I do want to sort of continue working on in the future. I mean, urban experts are only really now being problematized by critics as particular kinds of actors. I see that source I can add. Someone's asking, this book is Poverty Knowledge by Alice O'Connor. But we're sort of only now coming to appreciate urban expertise as a sort of politically significant phenomenon within cities. And there's lots of other sort of energies within social science that are starting to sort of critique expertise and the role of experts, and something that I think urban sociology should do more of. I mean, if you just sort of think about, I don't know, the sort of terms and concepts and sort of measures and objects, sort of epistemological objects that are mobilized and legitimated by urban sociologists, by city planners, and there's a whole sort of world of concepts that are sort of central to urban politics, and I think it's important that we sort of understand this. I mean, you know, as I said, I live in London now, and in sort of London development battles, there's sort of always this question about, and this is sort of similar to many cities, but there's always this question about, you know, whether or not it is financially viable for developers to sort of meet the requirements for providing affordable housing in their sort of big housing demands. And there's a sort of document that you have to file, sort of analyzing the financial viability of your project. So you know, developers file these things, but they're actually secret and they're not publicly available. But if developers sort of make the case that their project is not financially viable with supplying affordable housing, which is, as we know, is not even really affordable anyway, then they're sort of excused from this requirement. So here we have a sort of technology of a sort of I don't know, urban epistemological sort of object, this sort of analysis that they offer, and it's sort of quite central to how these housing developments get built, and ultimately, I think it sort of does play a crucial role for the future of housing in London today. I mean, imagine if financial viability was sort of subjected to critical scrutiny. You know, maybe we would have quite different housing developments here in London, or if there was something beyond sort of financial viability that sort of goes into these official analyses. I mean, these are the sort of questions that I think a sort of urban sociology knowledge should ask. And as I said, I mean, it is something that's not really sort of fully developed, but this is a sort of, I don't know, intellectual interest of mine and an academic interest that I hope to help develop.
Okay, now we have another question by Liu Han, which begins with "Hi, David." It's the common beginning of our questions.
Great. Should I read this one as well?
Giovanni, yes, thank you.
Okay. So, hi, Dave. I found the article very interesting and critical. Thank you. In part of the article, you mentioned that state actors work alongside real estate developers who have penetrated state functions. I'm starting to research these links between public and private actors in different countries of Latin America, and I find it's a very opaque issue because many times there are illegal practices involved. So I'd like to know a little more about the American case you studied, or the Dumbo case specifically, but in this case you saw that the project was pursued by real estate development and community groups, because I think these links are more open and clear in the American case. So the question would be, in what ways have you seen that real estate developers assume state functions? Thanks for this. I think it's, I mean, I don't know, I think it's more sort of how is the state sort of working along, as you say, working alongside and collaborating with real estate actors to pursue specific projects. And I mean, I think you can, I think you're right that this is quite sort of public and open in New York. I mean, there's a process for, I mean, not really contesting land use, but there's at least a process where there are hearings held and documents produced as part of the land use process and as part of the process of rezoning a neighborhood. And you can sort of see how, in this case, the sort of city government, because in different cities, you know, this might be something that land use might be determined by a sort of local council government or maybe by a national government. But you know, in New York's case, you can sort of see the city government adopting the neighborhood definitions and neighborhood goals of real estate actors, and of sort of working with them to try to build the type of neighborhood that real estate developers want to see. I mean, it's quite clear when developers ask for zoning changes, when they ask for particular kinds of infrastructure investments. It really is something that, I don't know, is quite sort of open. I would imagine in some contexts where it is, I don't know, not as transparent. You would need to do a bit more sort of investigating and maybe a bit of sort of just inferring to sort of see the state working hand in hand with real estate. But I mean, I do think that it is a dimension to neighborhood development in sort of every case with which I'm familiar, that it's never a matter of just community groups sort of building their neighborhood. There's always a sort of role by the state, by real estate, by all sorts of different groups in the sort of process of pursuing it and making a neighborhood. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's a sort of area that needs to be looked into in any instance, but I wouldn't want to sort of theorize these links beforehand, because I do think they take different shapes in different contexts. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, I think so. But we don't have any more raised hands, so I think that we can.
Looks like Laura has another question.
Which one? Please, Laura, can you speak, or would you like to write it? Okay, you write it.
Okay. So she says, I'm not sure if we're only supposed to stick to the respective paper of the author or also include his or her earlier work, but this citation might have also arisen within others in this chat. As you have worked extensively on conceptualizing and unlocking the notion of assemblage for critical urban research, how do you think that connects? And you say it's short this time. It's short, but maybe opens up a lot of issues. I mean, I don't know. I do think to some extent that the sort of concept of project, it does sort of similar, though not identical, clearly not, I think, all right, hopefully not identical work, sort of similar work to the concept of assemblage, or maybe to the concept of network, because they're both getting at just sort of the ways in which coalitions are made. But I don't know. I'm sort of hoping that this concept of spatial project can sort of remain rooted in this I don't know, the sort of critical urban theory literature a bit more than the concept of assemblage. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this question I think is maybe referencing some papers that I was co-author on in the journal City, and there was a bit of sort of debate about the concept of assemblage urbanism and its relationship to critical urban theory. And there we were, I mean, one of the things we were arguing is that the concept of assemblage sort of tends towards kind of unlimited empiricism. And so you often see people who sort of deploy this idea having these sort of gigantic lists of actors who are part of any assemblage, and I mean that's just sort of one of the sort of typical moves in this literature. I guess with the idea of project, I wanted to keep things a a bit more restrained. I mean, I don't go into the sort of issue of human, non-human actants. We could talk about that a bit if you want. But I don't know. I mean, I think this concept of project I was imagining is just a bit more rooted in political economy, a bit more limited maybe to collective human actors, I guess, than the concept of assemblage. But I don't know. I mean, I think that you're right to draw that connection. And as we say in the assemblage papers, I mean, there's a lot of really useful sort of theorizing within this literature as well. And I guess trying to sort of channel what I see as the really creative and good parts of that idea with this idea of project. But I don't know. What's your take on this, Laura? I guess you'd have to type your response, but.
She's typing right now. In the meanwhile, while she types, I think that you can also. Maybe you can speak to Laura as well. Yes. Why not, Laura? Yes. I just opened your microphone, please.
Okay, thank you, Giovanni. I think this is quicker than typing, because I think it's a good question how assemblage connects to the spatial project. And I thought while reading this paper, I was thinking, about you having written critically about assemblage before, that there were certain points where there could be maybe fruitful connections being drawn between spatial projects or the neighborhood as an assembled piece of urbanity, and I mean, I share a lot of the very critical or the issues people have between drawing assemblage into a critical urbanism or urban theory space, but nonetheless, if we were able to cherry pick some of the better parts of assemblage theory, I think especially questions like naming or the physical representations in Dumbo, maybe these could also be fruitful routes that could be explored by connecting assemblage theory to your more political economy orientated approach to spatial projects. And this is just from the top of my head. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would agree with that, and I mean, basically what we were saying in the paper to some extent was that there's, at least from our perspective, there is sort of critical value in cherry picking some of the sort of insights from this literature without adopting its ontology in a totalistic way. But I don't know. I mean, I read at one point in this paper that city dwellers produce their own neighborhoods, but they do not make them as they please. Obviously referencing the well-known formulation about people making their own history. And I mean, not to sort of bring back this entire sort of assemblage debate, but I don't think assemblage necessarily provides ways to understand why city dwellers don't produce their own neighborhoods exactly as they please. I think that's something that the critical tradition in urban theory and the political economic tradition can't speak to. So I mean, I think it's sort of at that point we're sort of understanding the sort of larger structures within which neighborhood as a spatial project is cathected. I think that's where this idea of project and assemblage part ways.
Okay, thanks. I was saying maybe David, you can ask also some questions to the critics. Maybe you'd like to know something about them or about their experience in the field. Meanwhile, I see that Laura has raised her hands again. Would you like to speak, Laura, again, since there is no other questions in the meanwhile? Okay, Laura, the microphone is yours again.
Sorry, the hand was actually from before.
Okay. Would you like to say anything, or it's all right like this?
I think Lindsay wants to say something. I might go again afterwards.
Okay, Lindsay, speak right. Let's see if I can open your microphone. Lindsay, you can speak if you want. No, sorry, just writing. Okay.
Lindsay says, would you consider activism by urban/neighborhood assemblages to be a form of Lefebvre's experimental utopias? Yeah, I mean, I guess, as I said, I'm a bit ambivalent and sort of ambivalent about this concept of assemblage in general, maybe is the best way to put it. So I'm not totally clear what you're asking, but yeah, I mean, I think Lefebvre provides a lot of, I mean, not examples, but just sort of languages within which we can sort of understand, obviously, many different types of urban spatial actors, and of course the sort of utopian element that runs, I think, through all of Lefebvre's work, sort of speaks to the general practice of sort of producing and imagining emancipatory space and egalitarian space and revolutionary space. So I think you know a lot of Lefebvre's thought obviously can be sort of connected to this discussion by sort of, I don't know, using it as an inspiration for thinking about radical alternative spatial projects. I mean, again, it's the type of thing that sort of seems like a theoretical import, but it was, I was doing some, sort of as part of this project, I was doing field work with a sort of housing activist group, as I said, called Fury, which I mentioned in the paper, Families United for Racial and Economic Equality. And we were at a sort of Fury protest sort of manifestation, and you know, one of the speakers sort of got up and was saying, you know, we're not going to get displaced from the city because we have a right to the city, which was such a beautiful thing, sort of seeing this phrase, you know, which is sort of endlessly debated and chewed over by academics, being used by activists in a really sort of direct way. I think it was great, and it's a sort of example of activists trying to sort of change the direction of the dominant spatial projects in New York in an explicitly sort of Lefebvrean tradition, so or Lefebvrean language. So absolutely, I mean, if you want to sort of think about emancipatory and radical space, obviously Lefebvre is the sort of first stop. So completely. I see that Lindsay says, that's great. I'm personally very interested in how people disenfranchised by development find a voice and utilize this vocabulary of a right to the city dialogue. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely happening. And I mean, this is also a case of sort of what happens with critical urban knowledge. I mean, in the US, there's this sort of broad coalition of groups that are connected under the sort of umbrella of the Right to the City Coalition. And especially in New York, there were a lot of sort of meetings between urbanists and sort of urban researchers and grad students and professors and housing activists. And a lot of housing activists themselves are PhD students or professors, and there's just a lot of sort of fluidity between these two worlds. And the Right to the City sort of circulates amongst all of them. And I think the more that sort of critical urbanists are sort of doing work around the concept of the right to the city, the more it becomes, I don't know, at least sort of legitimized in the academy. And there's some sort of interesting and kind of unexpected sort of echoes of that when it becomes a public concept that can be used by other groups, you know, sort of pursuing their spatial politics.
Okay, that's great. And as I was telling before, this is in the last session. This is the first time that we use this kind of instrument, and speaking actually is very quick. I mean, we can express a lot of concepts in shorter time than it was before, while before we were used to write everything, both answer and questions. So
I see.
okay, so this is much quicker, and that's better because we can exchange much more ideas. There is two hands raised. The first one is Ursula Wozniak, and Ursula, can you speak? Can I open your microphone? I'm opening it now. No, you can speak. Okay, you just post your question in the chat. Just type your question so that we can read it aloud.
Great. Ursula says that she has a rather simple question. I hope that the
that's great
emoticon. So great. Let's see what you have.
Emoticon smiling. Well, it's simple, but it's not so short.
Okay. Oh, it's neither simple nor short, but okay. So the question is, in a footnote of your article, you mentioned to have had to omit a detailed discussion of the notion of community. I would nevertheless like to ask about this very term, as you acknowledge it being a competing term with the neighborhood itself, while at the same time applying it as an analytic prism next to state and capital. You do speak about different community groups competing in Dumbo, but it still seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that resistance is subsumed under the community term, whereas, for example, the local landlords which approve the development are not included in the community groups category. Certainly, the notion of the community is an effective discursive tool for political mobilization on the neighborhood level and to be analyzed as such. But does your understanding of community go beyond this native use of the category in the field? As you also show in your article, community is not less of a mystifying or ideological term than neighborhood, so I wondered whether you see a methodological surplus by insisting to use this term, for example, for the analysis of the constitution of an urban subject in the spatial project of the neighborhood. Wow, yes, that is definitely not a simple or short question, but that's a great question. And no, don't apologize. Thank you for reading this so closely. I think that, I mean, just my sort of immediate response is that the idea was not to go beyond the sort of native use of this category in the field. That I was sort of invoking groups that legitimize themselves by reference to this idea of community, which, I mean, as you say, is a floating contested signifier as much as neighborhood is. Yes, landlords, I mean, I think landlords often would sort of speak, I would sort of adopt the mantle of community. I mean, it's a very powerful sort of rhetorical move on their part to sort of, which they're trying to do all the time, sort of legitimize the sort of interests of real estate as the community interests. But I merely meant that these are sort of organizationally separate collective actors. And it's also in New York, there's definitely sort of this idea of community organizations and community-based organizations, and in a lot of places. Though I think it is maybe particularly strong in New York, this language. And so I was sort of merely referring to this realm of sort of collective actors. So yeah, I mean, these concepts are all contestable and contested. But I don't know. I mean, I thought quite a bit actually about sort of how to identify this collection of organizations, like the Dumbo Neighborhood Association, the Vinegar Hill Association, all of these different groups. And I mean, I would put, I think to some extent, I would put some of the collective efforts of Farragut residents and other New York City Housing Authority resident groups under the sort of mantle of community in this sort of broad sense as well. Even though, as I said, they're sort of pursuing a very different project than the sort of artists bourgeois Dumbo projects pursued by these community groups. So yeah, I guess short answer, I am not intending this concept of community to go beyond the sort of native usage. I do think that community as a sort of an idea in sort of, I don't know, the last 200 years of urbanism has its sort of different a different trajectory than neighborhood to some extent. And I don't know, I mean, neighborhood also sort of captures the sort of territorial dimension, I think more so than community, and sort of shows these links with sort of, I don't know, other urban knowledges like neighborhood effects. But yeah, that's that is an extremely good point that you make.
Okay, wonderful. Stefan has already his microphone open. So Stefan, are you able to speak? Stefan, we cannot hear you. We don't hear you. Okay.
Okay, typing is fine.
Sorry. Normally it works, but this kind of system has some issues.
Oh, wow.
For instance, you cannot use in a library. I mean, you cannot speak in a library.
Oh, right.
So.
Well, I see the question now, so I'll read this. As a Brooklyn native, I found it very interesting. Your discussion of the concept of neighborhood put me in mind of one of my favorite Neil Smith articles, Contours of a Spatialized Politics, in which he lays out a typology of scales. He discusses the concept of community as a geographic scale between the home domestic scale and the urban scale, and describes it as fundamentally a scale of social reproduction, as a scale of education, health, childcare, food, etc., contrasted with the urban scale, which he describes as a scale ordered by the labor market. I wonder if the concept of social reproduction is one that has resonance for your understanding of the neighborhood, and if questions of reproduction were particularly salient in the neighborhood projects you describe. Absolutely. I mean, and that's also, that is a great point, and I'm glad that my article is putting people in mind of Neil Smith articles. And I mean, I think his point there is sometimes sort of lost in sort of urban debates about development. I mean, people end up debating, I think certainly in sort of public debates, and to some extent in academic debates, end up sort of debating development and neighborhood in ways that are quite detached from reproduction and production. And I think they're obviously quite crucial. I mean, I'm not sure that, I don't know, I would say that neighborhood necessarily, you know, is particularly connected to social reproduction as opposed to sort of other sort of political, economic dimensions. But I completely take the point, and I think he's sort of right to understand, you know, this connection, you know, between sort of scalarity and political economic function. So yeah, no, that is a great connection that you're drawing there as well. I don't know if that answers your question, or is
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think we have done one full hour and a half. Do we have any more questions or any more comments or anything? Because normally in writing, the length, the time that we spend on this is 2 hours. But I think that 1 hour and a half, it's quite a lot when we are able to speak. So we communicate much quicker. So
well, if anyone has any sort of final thoughts, I guess no one will sort of speak up for the idea of neighborhood per se as an urban public good, which I guess that's a good thing, at least from my perspective. But if anyone has any sort of final thoughts or points, obviously, you know, say them now, or you know, I'm happy to email with anyone who has further comments they want to make, my email address is in the piece, but I've also just entered it into our chat window.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the email, so that we can read it. And this is your last chance to interact in this nice way with David Madden. And so, if you are happy with this, I think we can close this. And I thank a lot to David Madden for this very interesting article, and also for his very nice way of dealing with these new means of communication. You've been really great, David. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thanks a lot again for inviting me. It was really nice to speak to all of you, and thanks for reading the article and for responding to it.
Yeah, also our participants.
David.
Sorry?
I think it was a very thoughtful discussion for everybody, and I think everybody can take home something important for his or her own work.
Well, that's perfect then. That's more than I could have asked for. So thank you so much.
We keep in touch. We will make available the audio file online. I hope you don't mind. And it will be available also on the IJO website at some point. And we will inform you about that.
All right. Thanks a lot.